Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we're obsessed with story, we celebrate creativity, and we look to talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University. I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, you can check out seanmurphy.net. But as I always like to say, the best part of the different roles I play is it gives me an opportunity to be in contact with very interesting people. Today is absolutely no exception. Let me introduce Will Boast, our guest today. Will is the author of short story collection Power Ballads, a memoir Epilogue, and a novel Daphne. His short fiction, reporting, and essays have appeared in, among others, the New York Times Magazine, the New Republic, the Guardian, and many other publications. He's held fellowships from Stanford University, the American Academy in Rome, and others, and he's taught at Stanford, the University of Chicago, and the Joel Nafuma Refugee Center in Rome. He currently lives near London, so it's wonderful to go across the pond and have a conversation. Will, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, real pleasure to thanks for the invite. And as I said, I've been really enjoying the podcast, and it's a real pleasure to be with you.
Well, as I said to you before we came on, all writers and in my opinion, readers should do this. When you read something that moves you or inspires you or infuriates you or any
Mm.
combination, you should reach out to the author and
Yeah,
let
yeah,
them know.
great.
I was delighted to make your acquaintance via the always awesome Lit Hub that linked to your remarkable piece in the recent Virginia Quarterly Review, which is entitled From the Gut, A Literary History of Indigestion. When I read it, as you know, I absolutely loved it and thought we need to dive into this. So I'm very grateful for your willingness to be here. Let me tee up the essay, which I've got a million questions about. But you write, quote, "The gastrointestinal agonies of writers, it turns out, forms practically its own canon, one that dates back almost to the beginning of Western science's attempts to understand the digestive tract." And you name check some very heavy hitters, including Voltaire, Coleridge, Twain, Henry James, Kafka, and Beckett. So let me just say, in the best possible way, the cliche, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think for writers, it's more like never let a personal health obsession fail to inspire a deeply researched project. So tell us a bit about how this piece came together and why you were the ideal person to tackle it.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Uh, Gosh, I wish would have had you on hand when we were trying to write the nut graph for this, because the editor I worked with, who I've worked with several times before, Paul Reyes at Virginia Quarterly Review, who is a fantastic editor and really old school. He really does he's very meticulous, and I love being meticulous, and he's always able to go on those journeys with me. But yeah, sort of making sense of all this disparate information and coming to that couple sentences that you just mentioned there took a little while. So yeah, it would have been nice to have your summarizing power on hand. Yeah, so yeah, you're right that it kind of largely comes from the fact that, for better or for worse, I've had a pretty tricky stomach for basically since my 20s, and to jump right to the embarrassing fact of it's just, IBS, inflammatory bowel syndrome, which I feel like had I written about this, say, 10, 20 years ago, I would have been mortified to be writing about it. But we live in a, as the essay sort of argues, we live in a new era of obsession with the gut.
Yeah.
And that subject seems to come up more and more and more. You go into Amazon or you go into the bookshop, and you can see shelves of books about this subject, and lots of medical research around it, and lots of, like, let's say, personal testimonies now extant on social media, including from often some very young people, which often surprises me. And so I think as we've learned more about the digestive tract, and gut health, and the flora and fauna of our guts, this increase in knowledge has also led to exactly what you're describing, a kind of new crisis. It's as if we learn about something and we peel back the mystery around it and then immediately become very fretful about it, which is not an uncommon thing in history. I think it happens often that there's enough scientific knowledge that gets into the mainstream that all of a sudden people find it a new cause for concern, let's say. So there was all that floating around, but really a lot of this came from, my own sort of struggles with what I can and can't eat. And then also, this is going to sound a little weird, but I, one of my favorite writers is, well, two of my favorite writers are Flaubert and Turgenev, and there's the famous, correspondence between them. And gosh, it must have been 20 years ago that I was reading it, and I was struck by how often they were mentioning, their stomachs, basically, and I swear that there was some line in there that really made me kind of perk up my ears and say, "What on earth are they talking about?" And it was something along the lines of one asking the other, "Do you think that diarrhea or constipation is more suited to a literary temperament?" I'm like, what are they talking? And I've gone back and I've tried to find that line, and I found many other lines in their correspondence about digestion, including one from Turgenev I quote in a letter. But I was never able to find that line, but it was enough to kind of stick in the back of my head, and then eventually make me think, well, where is that coming from? And it did speak to kind of an interesting 19th century fixation on digestion and digestive complaints, but it goes further back than that. And the essay sort of chooses 1700, so the beginning of the Enlightenment, as a place to begin. But you could just as easily go back to, say, ancient Rome, where they were already thinking about these things obsessively. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the reason I'm so enamored with this essay is it does everything a good story and what good storytelling does. It contextualizes, a historical issue that resonates literally across time and space and culture. But so we can appreciate that on kind of a macro level, like this is a human obsession or a human issue that we've struggled with. But what makes your essay, I think, particularly valuable, at least two things. One, it happens to be a topic that, if not taboo, is something that, from speaking only of my own observation, is at once everywhere, but something that people don't want to talk about. So it's this weird liminal space where it's a topic everyone has an opinion on, or everyone has a strong opinion about why we shouldn't talk about it. So there's that. But then it peels back further. In addition to your own personal infusion of your own life story, it's something that writers have always had. Like it's close to the bone in literary history.
Yeah.
So on multiple levels, you're kind of unpacking this huge topic. And what I admire about your writing is you're weaving in your personal story, which I think is critical. There's a lot of historical evidence, which is welcome. But then when we get into, well, maybe this is one of the reasons writers tend to be so weird and passionate and sensitive. It's all interwoven. But I also think, and you kind of just articulated it, where does story begin, or how does a writer get into a story?
Mm.
Inevitably, to invoke another cliche, it's the whole write about what you know. What could be more relevant to a writer than something that they deal with and understand? And I think what separates that from a diary entry is then trying to contextualize it and universalize something and say, why does this resonate with so many people? And I think your essay does that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thanks, Sean. That again, if only we had you on hand during the editing to say this beautiful stuff. I love it. Yeah, I mean it's embarrassing. Obviously, it's an embarrassing subject, and I suppose we should question why that is. I think at various points in history, people have been more frank about it, but maybe potentially in our very hygienic age that we live in, which is really kind of a something that's kind of passed along to us from the Victorians, when hygiene became, a subject that people were discovering and theorizing and learning about kind of for the first time, sort of like mid late 19th century. So yeah, we're bodies, and we are not just brains, and the idea that we have a second brain in our gut is seems like a new idea, but actually they kind of have been talking about that, for quite some time, really. I mean, if you go all the way back, to people like, well, you have to go back to Galen, but also in various points in the Middle Ages and then into the Enlightenment, people didn't quite know how the parts of the body were related, and there was a idea out there that the stomach, the gut was where the soul was located. Was something that was a very big part of controlling who we are emotionally, and I think that kind of makes a kind of intuitive sense, right? A kind of gut
Yeah.
level sense to use the obvious pun there.
Yeah.
But if you are someone who suffers from a digestive complaint, boy, it can make your mood quite sour quite quickly, right? Just like a sort of pain in the another part of your body might easily do. So, yeah, I guess I was interested to kind of take it from, just the kind of fun kind of did you know sort of trivia and into kind of a realm where you can almost think about these complaints as a kind of creative prime mover almost. Is that something isn't sitting right, if you will,
Yep.
and then how does that almost become like an existential complaint? And in fact it really does. Once we get to, you mentioned Beckett up top, like Beckett might be the apotheosis of this, because he wrote so much about um, puke and shit and all
Yeah.
kinds of nasty bodily stuff, is that he was someone who, for purging and expulsion and enemas, and he went to a psychiatrist to talk about it, psychoanalyst to talk about his constipation. He thought that would heal it, perhaps out of desperation. But once you get to him, and he refers to his work as word shit, and or elsewhere he calls his body of work turds for my central lavatory. So clearly, he was joking, I guess. But the high
Yeah.
and the low, the bodily and the intellectual, the gross and the sacred are all kind of mixed up in Beckett, and that's something that's really great about him. So yeah, so he's not the only writer to do that, but I think maybe in some ways the apex. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like, this is a great example of the service that writers provide. I mean, I personally think that we provide a lot of services, but being able to talk about taboo, being able to be frank, in the service of facilitating conversation. I think one mistake that people that perhaps I've lived my life envying any individual with an iron stomach, whether it relates to what they eat and the effect it does or doesn't have on them, how that impacts their ability to travel, to plan
Mhm.
their day, etc. And we can get into some of that more too. But um, I think it's so what people maybe don't understand is it's so, as you've already pointed out, is so laden with metaphor and pun potential. But I think anyone that has so let's just say a non-iron stomach or doesn't think about those things at all, many of us would love to be like that. I don't think there's a self-indulgence or kind of a solipsism about why are you so focused on your gut? Like, who cares? The reality is, I liken it to allergies. People that don't have allergies don't understand. Like, so you sneeze, what's the big deal? And it's
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
these things are can impact everything from physical to mental health,
Yeah.
and most people would trade anything to not be
Yeah.
inflicted with this. So I think the ability of writers to talk about this, yes, there's a therapeutic element. Yes, there's an obvious indulgence of focusing, literally navel gazing.
Yeah.
But I think it shows that while your essay goes deep on how this is directly impacted so many writers and creatives. This is again a universal issue. So talking about it
Yeah.
helps break down the taboo, helps raise awareness. And not for nothing, we're in an era right now, unfortunately, where health now and discussions about everything from vaccines to healthy living
Yeah.
is once again being thrown up in the air and questioned. I don't think there's ever been a better time to have very frank and
Yeah.
honest discussions about.
Yeah.
There's not a one fit approach for
Yeah.
issues ranging from IBS to vaccines.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, isn't it? And well, but I think the interesting thing about this too is that it's also been the site of a lot of pseudoscience as well. Um, and maybe for some of the reasons that we've been talking about, that it is taboo, and when something is taboo, then the quacks can kind of come in, can't they? And they can have a little bit of a freer reign. Yeah, it definitely was a chance to make a lot of puns about this, and also to delve into some of this kind of odd scientific thought, right? And maybe
Yeah.
what it's I think science is always, well, usually is trying its best, I suppose, and but gosh, their theories were all over the place, weren't they? And
Yeah.
I think when it's something that's so surprisingly core to who we might be as individuals, and it touches on emotional health and psychological health. I think the other flip side of this is, which is why I wanted to talk about doctors and writers and scientists and writers, and sometimes writers stepping in to sort of play a kind of guru-like role, including people like Whitman and Twain, is that we have such a longing to be cured, you know,
Yeah.
and maybe, um, to be freed from these concerns, and yet we have such enormous appetites sometimes, like figuratively and literally.
I,
Uh, so we get ourselves in trouble, right? And the essay's been maybe partly about that as well.
for sure. And I'm glad you mentioned, 'cause first of all, in times like right now, I think it's good for perspective to be reminded that through human history, there's very little new under the sun.
Yeah.
There are these cycles of health fads and
Right.
hucksters and opportunists. You illuminate some people I've heard of and some that I haven't. But one statistic that you mentioned that blew my mind, and I guess it shouldn't have, but over-the-counter digestive remedy industry is valued now at over $20 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it underscores that this topic has consumed people for centuries,
Yeah.
um, but reliably, and maybe more so than
Yeah.
other health ailments. It has been a ripe field for
Yeah.
hucksters and opportunists. Talk a little bit about, I think right around the turn of the 20th century was when we had a couple of famous health gurus
Yeah.
who, not so coincidentally, um, didn't not make money from the work they were doing, and
Yeah.
I think we're still feeling some of the repercussions of that movement
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a cultural historian of this stuff. I relied on some other people's research, obviously,
Sure.
but it seems to me that, yeah, once you get to Kellogg and Graham and people like that,
Yeah.
it starts to feel like the kind of modern day, food science that we have today. Um, so they're making cereals, and Graham is grain bread that eventually becomes graham crackers, and you know, um, Graham was a temperance minister, so he was very concerned with keeping people's uh, all their appetites in check, including like the idea was that you would eat a bland cracker and it would keep you from drinking and masturbating, which okay, why that
I
would be the case, it's hard to tell, but and then Kellogg had his famous sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan, and I think people might be aware of who what that was and what they were doing there. But basically, it was a health spa, kind of German style health spa that people would go to, and they would get curious, treatments like yogurt enemas and be eating lots of very bland cereal-like food. He didn't just make cereal, but he made weird things like canned nut loaf and other particularly unappetizing things like that. And I think it would be kind of the late 19th century version, a turn of the century version of like a detox, and then the other fun figure that gets wrapped up in this around this time is Horace Fletcher, who I'm not the first person to write about, but he always does get involved in this because he's probably the nuttiest version of all this. And his idea was that you can cure not just digestive ailments, but all kinds of bodily and mental, problems with excessive chewing. And when I say excessive, I mean like hundreds of times a bite. I think his, average bite was 200 times or something like that. And it sounds insane now. Like the idea was that you would chew enough that it would basically just slip down your throat unaided because it would be a slurry after you've been chewing so many times. And it sounds completely barmy, but it was so influential for a brief time. I mean, he had both Henry James and William James doing this, Rockefeller, British royals, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Twain.
Yeah.
So it was a fad, but it was a fad that was picked up by a lot of people. And then I think eventually, medicine came along and said, there's really no benefit here, so, or
Right.
the benefit is only what your mother could have told you, don't bolt your food, basically. So,
Right.
yeah, it's funny because people go to these insane lengths sometimes, and but you kind of understand why, right? And I think that when you have a kind of chronic issue like this, I suppose, and some things help it, but then weirdly you do all the right things and then you still have problems.
Right.
You will go to these lengths, and you will look for someone who will, liberate you from this.
Yeah, and I think that speaks on a lot of levels to maybe the history of like just Western medicine, the
Mm.
good, the bad, the ugly,
Yeah.
all of it. I also think, and maybe I'm reading too much into this or being too opportunistic, but I think again we're living in an era right now where it's certainly in America where the appeal, not necessarily of authoritarianism, but an authority, someone that can confidently say,
Sure.
this is what's wrong, and here's
Yeah.
how you fix it. And
Yeah.
as we've seen throughout history, people will follow that, or people will spend significant amounts of money, or go to extraordinary lengths to be pacified by the authority. And with the benefit of hindsight, of course, we can see this kind of roller coaster of nutty,
Yeah.
diagnoses, but also things that have percolated in the culture. And to me, I think that's what's so great about the history and reading and storytelling, being aware of like what's worked, what hasn't worked.
Yeah.
There's not one answer, and even if there is an answer that seems to work, that's not going to apply in all cases. So this balanced approach of understanding, it gets into like I did my own research and I followed the science. A little bit of all of those things go a long way, but
Yeah.
it was not lost on me while I was reading your piece that this this universal historical appeal from people, whether they're cynical or genuine, of having that confidence. There's this natural tendency for people to follow that and be reassured by that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it gives you your Dr. Oz's and your, kind of other, yeah,
Bingo.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously the anti-vax movement, which is not just about vaccinations, is it? Right. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and again, I think it speaks to these things wouldn't have any cultural relevancy if there weren't profoundly affected or impacting lots of people. I mean, I
yeah,
think some of this wacky stuff that you describe would have been very faddish, but again, it speaks to the fact that for that to resonate with that many people to become an actual movement,
yeah,
that does mean that lots of people, including sensitive types,
yeah,
writerly types, but
yeah,
also just regular people have to, but everyone is impacted by this. And again, it never can be lost on the fact that this goes throughout history. So our diets have changed, our habits
Mhm.
have changed, our lifespans have changed.
Yep.
But this is really significant primal stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's it there's so much to say about uh, how we think about food and how we moralize food. Food can be political, food can be emotional, right? And and I think that maybe also the thing the piece is interested in is and I guess I have written about this elsewhere, but the physiological and the psychological and how the two are twined together. Yeah.
And it's a perfect segue because I want to dive a little deeper into that. Just thinking kind of in real time here.
Mhm.
If someone were to put me on the spot and say, "Well, it's all in your head," or how do
Yeah,
you define someone with an iron stomach versus
yeah,
someone that doesn't? I
yeah,
would say, in my own experience and observation, there's all kinds of nuance, but generally when anxiety or grief presents, there
mm,
are types of people that eat their grief and types of people that can't eat. And I've always been in the latter camp. When I'm anxious or under stress, my appetite goes away.
yeah,
And of course, then you go down a rabbit hole of people saying that's good because it causes you to lose weight. So
yeah.
I've kind of sardonically said best way to go on an effective diet is have something profoundly unsettling happen in your life. No one would really want to go through that. But
Yeah,
understanding that that's a very simplistic way, but if we were to divide it into two camps,
yeah,
there's something I think that speaks volumes about if someone's under duress and they're both able and need to eat and
yeah,
feed that, it's saying something about how their constitution works, just like if someone perhaps is up
yeah,
here too much,
yeah.
maybe ironically, it directly impacts their gut. Am I on to something there, or is that too
No,
far?
yeah, I think that's right, Sean, and I think that's something that is kind of behind. So just to go back to so I mentioned the piece starts in 1700, and that not just because it's a round number, but because that's the year when a physician, basically a medical professor, Bernardo Ramazzini, publishes basically the first work of occupational medicine. It's called The Diseases of Workers. And he studied laborers of all different kinds, porters, people carrying things on their shoulders and noticing that they tend to kind of have a hunched back, or that he looks at you know occupations that don't really exist anymore, like lute string makers, for example, and notices that when lute string makers are twining their lute strings, they're looking at them very closely and they get weak eyesight from it. So occupational injuries, basically work injuries, and he also fascinatingly studies writers, right? Scholars, philosophers, poets, and he finds that and again, it's hard to know if this was good science or what, but he finds that he thinks that because they're hunched over their desks all day, they compress their pancreatic juices, and it thus causes them to have digestive problems, basically. So anyway, it's arguable, but it kind of makes a certain degree of horse sense in a way, and you could kind of connect that to the kind of the very contemporary idea that sitting is the new cancer and sitting is bad for us, right? So these ideas have been around for a long time. Anyway, the fascinating thing is that this is initially seen as you know, uh, as a danger, as a risk of doing this work, as an unfortunate, side effect of doing this scholarly, hunched over your desk work. But by the end of the 18th century, it's become like a weird. The weirdness of this is that it becomes almost like a prerequisite for it, right? That it becomes like a something that makes you good at doing this hunched over your desk, scholarly, intellectual, philosophical, thinky work. And at this point, there are doctors, French doctors mostly, theorizing this and putting a name to it, les maladies de gens de lettres, so the illnesses of men of letters, the illnesses of men of letters. And and this is the fascinating. This is what I went to read about this, and there's a surprising number of scholarly books out there about it in the last 10 years or so. This was the point where I was like, oh, okay, there's something really fascinating and fun here, and so reading these scholars. Uh, so yeah, it was a lot of fun for one thing. But once you get
Yeah.
to people like you mentioned Coleridge up front, like once we
Mhm.
get to Coleridge and people like Byron and things like that, we're getting into the Romantic era, and there's now the idea that the ideal artistic temperament is to be frail and sickly and melancholy.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and Coleridge goes around bragging about his constipation and his flatulence, right? Not complaining about it, but basically saying like, this is a mark of how great an artist I am. And it's so funny to think
Yeah.
about one of the great, poets in the can. I mean, one of the,
Yeah.
top whatever,
Yeah.
telling people, "Oh, I was so farty today," and that's because I'm a great genius, and this is part of what makes me a great genius, and it's so yeah. What you're saying is that the idea that there's a kind of disquiet or a kind of quality that makes people sort of sensitive and susceptible and maybe they're not the hail hardy conquerors of the world that others with iron stomachs might be, but they can kind of meditate over their emotional state and the state of their of the state of their disquiet all day. That's where it all kind of intersects, I think. And another sort of amazing intersection is that Horace Fletcher, the guy I was talking about earlier, who got so many people on board with his chewing regimen. One of the people that did that was Franz Kafka, and turns out that Kafka suffered from a very severe constipation almost his entire life, and wrote about it frequently in his diaries and his letters, and went to various sanitarium for it, and apparently never was able to find a cure for it. But he was someone who was desperate enough to try this Fletcherism method, and there's accounts of his father, sitting at the dinner table and hiding behind his newspaper so he didn't have to see Franz, chewing his every bite 200 times.
Yeah.
And I think that you can sort of see that in Kafka. There's that enervation, there's that anxiety. It's obviously a huge part of his work, and so in the essay I do a kind of a reading of a hunger artist from that lens, and I think I'm pretty convinced by it. But folks will have
Right.
to check out the essay to see what they think. But yeah.
It's almost too good to be true, right? Like, so what was the central metaphor? No, he was talking about his own digestion. Like, don't need to dig too deep to get into that,
Yeah, sometimes we're a little too clever when we read this stuff. We just go directly to it. But
right?
but how can it not be part of that, right? You know what I mean? If this was someone who was thinking about his digestion day after day after day after day and writes a story about someone, a hunger artist who never eats, it's
Yeah,
got to be there, right? Like there's
sure.
absolutely no way it can't be. And maybe some person smarter than I has written about it, but I looked for it and I couldn't find it. So
Interesting.
yeah,
Interesting.
maybe we're too clever sometimes with our
Yeah,
analysis.
and also I think it just underscores the fact that the body is an ideal metaphor,
Mm.
always has
Yeah,
been.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
we don't need to go too deep into the imagination to kind
yeah,
of extrapolate the cause and effect of what we
yeah,
put in us, what comes out of us, and
yeah, yeah.
everything that kind of impacts that. I want to go even a little bit deeper because I think that if I were to say like so as we go down the rabbit hole of like universality, historical, but
Mm.
now we're getting into writers.
Mhm.
Many of us would agree, and absolutely not imperative, but writers tend to be more sensitive. Writers tend to have a certain empathy. Writers have a curiosity, a compulsion,
Yeah,
and the desire to write something down. There
yeah.
isn't a literal selfishness about the act.
Mhm.
I've always been fascinated with the whole chicken egg proposition of is
Mm.
it the sensitivity that is imbued into an individual that makes them gravitate toward creativity, or is the creativity feeding the physical sensitivity? I've always found that it is absolutely a combination of both.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think there's something more to unpack there about, not to say that all writers have experienced trauma,
Sure.
but
Sure.
this sensitivity that is developed through physical or mental frailty
Mm-hmm.
um, does exacerbate
Yeah.
one's empathy, one's ability to make connections historically and kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
amongst people, that leads to better writing. So
Mm,
certainly, I'm not saying one impacts the other, but I think
mm.
there's a lot there.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. Yeah. And it's I just quote this line from one of the Turgenev Flaubert letters. This is Turgenev who says to Flaubert, "A slight excess of dairy produce has left him with the most violent colic. I think it must be possible to detect it in the very shape of the words and letters that I write. What a damned stomach." So basically, he was lactose intolerant, it sounds like, and yeah, and like Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, where he started Dracula after had a bad crab dinner, basically, and so yeah, Kurt Cobain probably had lactose intolerance. There's a surprising amount of medical research into whether Beethoven had IBS. So yeah, there is. Yeah, I mean, who's we're sort of there are writers out there who are hale and hearty, of course, but yeah, one does wonder, and Sartre has his novel Nausea, which is the line from I quote from Nausea is the nausea is not inside me, I feel it out there on the wall, in the suspenders everywhere around me. It makes itself one with the cafe. I am the one who is within it, right? It's not nausea in me, I am in nausea. And it's so yeah, it becomes almost existential at a certain point, and I mentioned Beckett as well, and so I think that that it's kind of that frailty or that sensitivity raised to the the kind of another hinge line in the essay is um, that it's maybe writers are incapable of stomaching the world as it is, right? That they just can't swallow it, they just can't digest it. It
Yeah.
sticks there and it hangs there and it keeps bothering you. And yeah, so maybe there is something in that it's an inability just to, you know, swallow it down, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and isn't there you quote an almost miraculous exchange, and you'll know who I'm referring to. I'm not going to remember the writer, but there's an exchange, something like, what's the matter? Indigestion. What
Right.
from? Reality. And I'm
Exactly.
like,
Yep.
there it is,
Yep.
right? There's the
Yep. Yep.
epigraph for the
Yep.
whole,
Yep.
the whole
Yep.
condition.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
Who is the writer I'm invoking that you quote
Uh,
there?
not a writer I know well. He's a kind of literary thriller writer, Carlos Rius Zafón. I'm probably saying that wrong, but yeah,
Yeah.
I dug around and I found that. Yeah,
Amazing.
it's all there.
Amazing.
Yeah, so yeah, and it makes it, yeah, as you said before, it kind of makes a kind of horse sense, doesn't it? That somehow or another it becomes philosophical at a certain point. Yeah.
And listen, I think there's something heroic about whether. So let's just assume, for the sake of this conversation, that writers are unduly prone to digestive issues.
Hmm.
What better way in terms of the human condition than to write about it and try to solve it and extend awareness and empathy, as opposed to retreating into oneself and
Mm.
being miserable. Writers, I will be the one to say, writers like yourself, trying to unpackage this, it is an act of community and expression and solidarity. So, hell yeah, for living in the belly of the beast. I've almost had to set myself up to a cattle prod, like, do not go nuts with the poop metaphors, and I've done a pretty good job so far. So maybe I'll make it through this conversation without
We
relying.
we got. I mean, you're able to restrain myself more than I was able to. It was. I think part of the fun was this is just the end of the day, it felt like at a certain point just an excuse to use every pun and synonym.
Potty humor sells. Well,
Oh, I mean, it's
at
yeah,
the
why
end of the
not? Why
day,
not? Yeah, the more the better.
let's not overthink this.
Exactly.
Well, so the billion-dollar question, right, is I'm so curious, is a larger piece in the works, or you feel like I mean, my own opinion, for whatever it's worth, you got the bat on the ball,
Hmm.
absolute home run. To me, this accomplishes this epitomizes what a great long form or even medium form essay.
Hmm.
You exhaustively cover it, but maybe because I liked it so much, I was like, there's probably a book here. Is that something that interests you, or are you feeling like I wallowed in that long enough? I got it out of me. Like again,
Hmm.
metaphor not intended, but pun not intended. I got it out of me, and I'm ready to move on to other things.
Yeah, yeah, Sean definitely thought about it, and you know, so I would say that actually there are a few books out there, not about this exact subject,
Hmm.
but there are a surprising number of books of medical history and cultural history on the subject already. So, for example, one that came out fairly recently, last year, by Elsa Richardson, who's kind of cultural historian, Rumbles: A Curious History of the Gut. Or there was a more scholarly book titled Gut Feeling that I read a pretty large chunk of. So there is a surprising number of
Okay.
books on that short shelf already. Yeah, I mean, what I did was, sort of synthesize a lot that reading plus a lot of other reading, really,
Yeah.
really surprising amount of things that I went to and just dipped into and and read at length and
Yeah.
for this to mostly focus it around literary figures, which was where I was most interested. So yeah, I don't know. If someone comes along and wants me to expand it, I'd happily do so. But
Right.
would be maybe competing with some other great books on this already. So yeah.
Well, that's a good enough transition into I would be remiss if I didn't point out my own admiration. I mentioned at the outset from your bio,
Mm.
short stories, novel, memoir, and you obviously have mastered the essay form. So first off, right, and baseball they call those, what are the five tool player that has all these different skill sets.
Mm.
Do you talk a little bit about the ease or comfort or delight with which you
Mm.
navigate between forms? Because as someone that's dabbled in those myself, I don't know if I could answer that question easily. I would just say there are different types of writing that it's again a combination of feeling out
Mhm.
this probably would work better as a poem, or this
Yeah.
needs to
Yeah.
be an essay, or of course when you're thinking with dialogue, maybe it gets to a novel. But maybe
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how you have evolved as a writer with these different skill sets.
Sure.
Uh, and again, would allow me to praise you and say that in and of itself to be published in those different genres is a significant achievement.
Cheers, Sean. That's kind of you to say. Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like I'm dabbling always because I don't know. It's kind of a weird feeling of because each piece has its own demands and like
Yeah.
I'm not really like I'm not like a you know experimental nonfiction writer really. I mean, I do a few little kind of formal things here and there. So I'm writing in a kind of you know nut graph and and here's your evidence and unpack your the kind of classic kind of essayistic form, I suppose. And
Yeah.
but every time is different and it's not. I guess the line I always use is fiction's the art of imagination and invention, and nonfiction is the art of selection and arrangement, which makes it sound like nonfiction is like like you're a just a curator of I mean,
Right.
that's not true either, really. It does take a lot of
Right.
you know invention and imagination to write nonfiction as well, I think. But it's like constantly moving the puzzle pieces around until they fit, and
Yeah.
finding kind of both the narrative and thematic through lines of it all, really. And I just read a great book about but a great collection of reported essays by David Gran. The one with the what's the title essays on Sherlock Holmes, and it is a little bit like you're doing that kind of investigative work almost. It's the devil in Sherlock Holmes, where it's
Mm.
is it deduction, I think, where it's like you look at the evidence and then you bring the ideas out of it, if that makes sense. I like to do that kind of nonfiction writing where you instead of kind of the high level, Susan Sontag kind of, these
Hmm.
are the kind of ideas, and I fit things to the ideas. I mean, I'm being a little unfair to her here, obviously, but or a lot unfair, but I guess it that I studied, I trained or whatever, as much as you can. Well, I started out as a fiction writer, and I still do think of myself that way, and still muddling along in that realm. But along the way, I kind of just discovered that I had a real admiration for journalists, magazine writers, long form journalistic writing, and I think it probably came from like reading Harper's a lot in the kind of mid
Yeah.
2000s, let's say 2005, 2010 or so, which
Mhm.
maybe it was just because I was so excited about that. But I kind of feel like back then Harper's was, and Harper's was still great, obviously, but that every issue of that magazine then was like a work of art with just like pieces where you're just like, where's, and
Yeah.
someone, where's this coming from, and how did this person find out about this? And there's a writer, John Mooallem, who mostly writes for the New York Times Magazine now. He's a contributor there, but and so I remember reading a piece by him about anti-gravity research, which is not like the classy, legitimate science that's being done today. It was like this crazy, fringy, lots of amateurs getting into it, and people trying to cure gravity, basically. And I really highly recommend it. It's called A Spooky Attraction, I think, um, and maybe Spooky Action. So also just kind of got interested in people like Ted Conover, or there's a writer, Jennifer Percy, who's a friend, and Matthew Power, who unfortunately passed away. And they would kind of go out into the world and they would sort of, find things, report, talk to people. And I kind of felt like that was exciting for me because, fiction writers are intrepid in their own ways, but often kind of tend to get wrapped up in a more academic kind of setting. So I love the idea that you could go out and find strange and wonderful things in the world, and potentially write about them in article form, essay form. So yeah, so I guess
Yeah.
it's kind of born out of admiration for what they're doing, but I've also continued to try to you know write fiction as well.
I think, again, generally speaking, the writers tend to find kind of the way water, finds its level.
Mm-hmm.
Certain types of writers, through either success or desire,
Hmm.
gravitate toward poetry or nonfiction
Yeah,
or novels.
yeah,
You are, again, I mean, you are just by virtue of the works you've published, you've never wanted to or been able to find, again, as someone that is of a similar vein. I personally find that very liberating.
mm-hmm.
I think there's an extra amount of discipline involved because
Yeah, yeah,
one can't literally navigate from, say, a poem to
yeah,
an
yeah,
essay with the same mindset.
yep,
But I
totally.
think as
Yep,
we accumulate skills,
yep,
the through line is this
yep.
curiosity and
Mhm.
wanting to solve some kind of problem. Maybe a novel is a little bit more a problem the writer's creating
Yeah,
with imagination.
yeah,
Essays and even poetry tend to somehow be a response to
mm,
stimuli, and
yeah,
you're able to solve that mystery, or there's at least the I think there's the ostensible promise that a well-written essay is solving a problem. Doesn't have to be definitive, but
yeah,
it's
sure.
taking on a
Yeah,
topic and
yeah,
rendering
yeah,
a judgment or a verdict, where perhaps with the novel the liberty and the freedom is
yeah.
writer can do whatever they want. But the fact that you haven't gravitated toward one form, I guess is what I'm at pains to say, is I think that's a sign of a writer operating at a very high level.
Cheers, Sean. It's interesting because like some of my favorite writers are kind of those more ambidextrous, how you say it? Ambidextrous. Like Orwell would be a great example, or Baldwin, or Natalia Ginsburg. Where they're kind of as known for their essays and nonfiction as they are for the. Actually, I think Orwell is a fascinating case to me because I think he was a born a nonfiction writer, essayist, journalist in ways. But when I read his fiction, like for example, 1984, I think is an amazing essay about totalitarianism, but it's weirdly not like dramatically that interesting. Like when I reread it, I was like, oh, he doesn't even meet like Winston doesn't meet Julia until like 70 pages into this novel, and nothing really happens plot wise pretty deep into it, but he's building out and describing, the tools of authoritarian control, like with the cataloging uh, animus of like a Foucault or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but you go and read like Burmese Days, and you're like, it's an okay novel. You know what I mean? But he
Yeah.
wasn't like a Balzac or a Dickens who could just keep inventing and inventing and inventing and inventing, right?
Yeah.
I just kind of think Baldwin is kind of similar in a weird way, but yeah. So I don't know. I do think there are people who are like natural novelists, let's say, like a Balzac or like you know, a Jane Austen or something.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, but then there's that kind of fascinating realm where people can kind of go in between the two modes, and yeah, and hopefully it's one kind of informs the other, I guess.
And I really appreciate the Orwell name check because I think that we could talk for a whole hour just
Mhm.
about the mastery. I think it's safe. Most serious readers would agree that Orwell was a masterful
Yeah,
essayist,
yeah,
uh, where perhaps his fiction can and should be picked over and critiqued, etc.
yeah.
I think that's teeing into what I said a minute ago. I think with totalitarianism, he of course had written about that,
Mhm.
but realized that that was a problem that he had to try to grapple with
Mm.
creatively in order to make it accessible and
Yeah,
not be a 100-page screed.
yeah, sure.
So
Yeah, yeah.
I have nothing but just awe for his. I suspect he might have enjoyed being able to
Mm.
knock that off as an essay and being done with it, but he
Yeah,
understood the ramifications and what was happening in real time,
yeah,
which he expressed in his nonfiction,
yeah,
demanded a serious kind of long form take on
yeah,
some
yeah,
of these issues that in order to be digested had to be rendered creatively, which is, I mean, one of the reasons we still read it 100 years later.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I should tweak what I was saying, because I think it's an incredible novel, but it's
Yeah.
a very essayistic novel.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I mean, here's what I'd say in praise. I'd say Orwell was actually too intelligent and passionate
Mm.
to write a really good potboiler. Not making any generalized
Sure,
statements about the relative levels of
sure,
intelligence in novelists or anything like
yeah,
that. But
sure,
I
sure.
do think certain writers had a. I mean, I
Mm,
think Oscar Wilde, certainly in Dorian Gray,
mm, mm,
he was too fascinated with the people and the dialogue to craft a more Dickensian,
mm.
but I think the work is richer for it and we forgive kind of the plot holes and the
Right,
I think
right.
Martin Amis was like that.
Sure. Yeah,
The novel was a delivery device for the language, and
yeah,
if
yeah.
you're good enough you get away with that, where mere mortals, they try to do that and they
Mm.
can't, so the books are unreadable.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that, yeah, because the novel is sort of the ultimate hybrid form, isn't it? And but I think sometimes we forget how much almost journalistic material has animated great novels, and on the other side of the coin, like something I like to bang the drum for is I think that like there's a lot of long form narrative literary minded journalists who don't get maybe the props for their writing that they should, and that form is as vital and as literary as any other, really. And
Absolutely.
So yeah, anyway, yeah.
Well, I think that tees up a question I did want to ask you, which so I appreciate that, which is I do worry a little bit. Like I'm not one that I mean, we've talked about historical trends, cultural trends, literary trends. I think there's something comforting in the kind of push and pull of what's popular and what endures. But I think we are living through an extended moment where brevity is in demand, or at least is
Mm,
so prevalent
hmm
that is the attention span for everything from movies to novels to even long form journalism.
yeah.
Not in danger because I think all art is always in danger, but it we are, I think, pushing against tides of attention spans. And
hmm
while I would be the last person to advise any writer to curtail their appetite, it gives me pause to think that because there's so much content and info overload
No,
and right now political anxiety,
yeah.
the luxury of reading novels and long form journalism is a bit under stress, and
Mm.
I wish that wasn't so.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could well be right, Sean. I think that, yeah, I think we all feel our attention spans kind of shredded by, you know, the news and social media and stuff. And I mean, although it's funny that I've noticed that some of my favorite podcasts recently are getting longer and longer. Like one of my favorite podcasts, oh, we just did our first 3 hour episode. It was like, oh wow, wow, incredible.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I don't know. But like I teach a little bit, and my students, a lot of them talk about they read like people like Brandon Sanderson, but he's publishing these. I've not read them, but they're massive, aren't they? They're like 1,000 pages each, aren't they? So
Mm.
so yeah, I guess that's right. But also interestingly, there does seem to be an appetite for these doorstop novels in genre form sometimes. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that could be something to unpack too. That you could you
Yeah.
make a really good point, Will, that if the data or my suspicion or what I'm hearing, observing is accurate, that the novel in terms of mass cultural appeal is maybe under some pressure because of social media, that's belied by the fact that someone will unthinkingly listen to a 2 hour podcast. And I think that speaks to technological trends,
Yeah.
the way we receive content.
Yeah.
So maybe some of this energy and creativity and discussion is occurring old school, via spoken word, which I don't think is a bad thing. I just think is the form is always evolving.
Yeah. Yep.
My job, I think, as a not only as a writer but as a reader and advocate, is to just encourage people to, like we've been talking about, not take a one size fits all approach, but understand that there are pleasures in an essay that you
Yeah.
can't approximate via a podcast. Therefore, let's encourage both the writing and reading of these different forms.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully they can all kind of knit together and one sort of supports the other, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's I think that's I don't know, but I hope that there's still a place for those, and also kind of in terms of page, column inches for long form reporting. Like in England, I'm here in England, in Britain now, and it's interesting because I think there's less of a infrastructure for long form pieces
Mhm.
here. I mean, really, there's only kind of there's like the Economist has a little bit of this stuff in the 1853 section or whatever, and the Guardian has their long read, but they
Yeah.
don't have the magazine and journal infrastructure that even the States have. So it's interesting, but obviously Britain supports the novel in a great way, and theater as well, right? So yeah, I
Right.
think some of this is cultural too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could have a conversation in 5 years, and we'll have more data to see what kind of cultural era we were going through.
Yeah,
I think history shows us that novels, poetry, the theater endure because people want that human connection. They want that
yeah,
originality, that authenticity. So I'm far from pessimistic, but I guess I do want to put my pitch in. And your essay, reaffirmed my abiding love of the form, and how when it's done well, it not only is satisfying, but inspires one to seek out that writer and send them an email and say, I want to talk to you about this. Which leads us to, I will put this in the write-up and the summary, as I always do. But Will, how can people find you online and discover you and read more of your work?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Sean. And yeah, and thanks again for the kind words and everything. I really appreciate that. It means a lot. I really appreciate it a lot. Well, I'm not so great at social, unfortunately. I mean, I'm on Twitter, just at Will Boast, and I have a website, willboast.org. And I keep telling myself I should get on Blue Sky or whatever we're supposed to be on now. But yeah, so you can find, links to various things on there. Uh, Daphne's in bookshops and Epilogue should be as well. And I guess maybe Sean, another thing I would point to that's kind of was recent and it was pretty fun is that I had a short story that was a finalist for the BBC and Cambridge's National Short Story Award this last autumn, and they anthologized it, but they also have an audio production they did for Radio 4, which is kind of like the cultural radio here on BBC.
Yeah.
And they got the actor Mark Strong to narrate it. So it's a neat thing, and I have to say that I was quite moved by his reading, even though I wrote it, which is not fair. But so yeah, that could be a place that folks could go just to see more online. It's titled "The Barber of Erice," Erice, which is a small Sicilian village, and it's about European migration crisis in quotes. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, as everyone can see in real time here, you're very humble and modest. Those are significant achievements. I'll be happy to trumpet them from my platform.
Oh, thanks.
Definitely, I think the greatest gift, in addition to your essay and having a chance to meet you, is when you find a good writer, you want to read all their stuff. So I will be checking back with you once I've absorbed more of your work. But you definitely expanded my thinking, and it'll be a tremendous pleasure to share this conversation. So I once again greatly appreciate you being here. The conversation was as awesome as I thought it would be. We managed to keep the shit-related puns to a minimum. So cheers to us for being adults.
Oh, we should have more. Oh yeah, cool. Thanks, Sean. I really appreciate it. It was really lovely to talk about this piece, especially. And yeah, I'd say that I've been enjoying your podcast, and it was a real honor to get the invitation. So thanks again.
Right on. Well, we'll talk to you again more soon. And everyone, thanks for checking this out. Remember that we are celebrating story, cultivating, and talking about creativity. So find out more at seanmurphy.net. Everyone stay safe, be well, and check out the links I'm going to put up and explore the world of Will. We will see you soon. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.